Hey folks, so today we're going to discuss spiritual bypassing. What is it? How can we avoid it? What are the problems with it? Coming up right next. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll have talks like this out Mondays and most Thursdays, so if you're interested, sign up and you won't miss them. So spiritual bypassing is a concept that was thought up by a psychologist named John Welwood. And the basic idea behind spiritual bypassing is it's the avoidance of unpleasant mental states or emotions in the service of some spiritual quote-unquote goal. It involves perhaps detachment from our own emotions, repression of our own emotions. It can be numbness, sort of a feeling of numbness within ourselves, a phobia of anger states, an overemphasis of positive states, a kind of a false positivity. And I think we know we've seen this in ourselves perhaps and in other people. And the main problem here is when we mistake that for spiritual maturity or psychological maturity. It's what I think some people call premature transcendence. What basically we end up doing, perhaps at times anyhow, is to numb ourselves to our own reactive, negative emotions, and then tend to believe that that numbing is an advance on the path. So for example, I know that many, many years ago, I was in a difficult relationship for a while, and at the same time I was practicing meditation, and I would do meditation every day. And one of the things that I noticed myself getting out of meditation that was a quote-unquote positive for me is that it was sort of numbing the emotions, the negative emotions that I was having, the sadness and so on from the relationship. And it was only in retrospect that I realized that that was an example of spiritual bypassing. It was an example of where meditation was really not healthy in that context. And oftentimes this spiritual bypassing can also come out because of our own self-judgment. That is to say, we may have a negative emotion like anger. We know that those kinds of mental states are harmful to ourselves and perhaps to others. And so because of our self-judgment, we turn away from them. We turn away from those kinds of states in ourselves. We become less aware of them, and we become less able to deal with them as a result. So this is an example of an unhealthy or perhaps at times even dogmatic use of quote-unquote spiritual practice. And I think many people who are secularists, who are non-religious or even anti-religious, may have an understanding of how religion can be unhelpful in these ways. It can lead some people at some times to repress these kinds of states in themselves so that they are not dealt with properly. They're not dealt with appropriately, or they're not dealt with maturely, in a mature manner or in a wise manner. And if they're simply repressed or pushed down, or if they're reacted against with aversion, they tend to come back in improper ways or inappropriate ways later. But while this can be a problem within a religious context, it can also be a problem, frankly, from within a secular or a rationalist context. And I think a perfect example of the kind of problems we can see. Think of the character of Spock on Star Trek. And when Leonard Nimoy talked about how he was constructing this character, who was, roughly speaking, designed after a kind of hyper-stoic model of rationality, quote-unquote logic, the person who supposedly was without emotion, although that was the cliche about Spock, as Leonard Nimoy said when he played the character, he did not play Spock as somebody without emotions. In fact, much the opposite. He played Spock as somebody with a great deal of emotion, but who was repressing those emotions. And in several of the more famous episodes of the early Star Trek, Spock ends up reacting very strongly because the emotions break out of him. And of course, while Spock is only a fictional character and we can't really take him too seriously, nevertheless, I think the general point is correct, that it can happen that people who are very secularist or who don't see themselves as engaged in any kind of a spiritual enterprise at all can nevertheless be the sorts of people who become detached from their own emotional states. They end up perhaps repressing or reacting against certain states that they see in themselves as irrational or harmful or not useful. And the main point here is that this kind of, in this case, this would be an example of spiritual bypassing, even if it isn't quote-unquote spiritual, it's a kind of bypassing. The point here is that if we don't face them directly and get to know them directly as emotional states and as states that are arising within us, we'll never be able to really overcome them. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is supposedly the first sermon of the Buddha, he discusses this very point in a sense. I mean, the discussion that he makes about knowing dukkha, or knowing our own suffering, as it were, that is, our own difficult emotional states, is extremely important. That is, we're not supposed to only know them conceptually from the outside as difficult states, but they have to be fully known and understood from within to be overcome. That is to say, not only do we have to experience them as these kinds of states from within, let's say, a mindfulness meditation context, but also seen as such and seen as difficult and seen as problematic, but also just seen as what they are. Difficult emotional states arising from the mind. But I think the most important point to make with respect to spiritual bypassing is that it happens to all of us, I think, at times, and it's something that we really all have to be aware of. It's a pitfall that I think people regularly fall into, whether they're within a religious path or a non-religious path or a secular path or whatever happens to be. And I think the thing to keep in mind is not to avoid unpleasant states when they arise, but to welcome them and confront them and understand them instead of trying to push them away. And this is actually one of the most difficult practices within Buddhism, or perhaps within any kind of related philosophy or teaching. But if we keep that in mind, that is to go towards the unpleasant state insofar as we can, then I think we'll be off on the right foot. Now, I should also say one word, I think, about what in the Buddhist tradition is called guarding the sense doors. That is, the Buddha does say sometimes that we are to avoid certain situations. Perhaps, let's say, we know that we are prone to overspend if we go to a particular store. Well, then the practice would be not to go to that store. That's called protecting the sense doors. That is, the doors of our senses are sometimes too porous. They let too much in. They let too much in that we grasp at, or perhaps that we get angry at or evince hatred towards. And if we know that, then it can be a correct practice, a good practice, at times simply to avoid such situations. And we might say, well, but isn't that a kind of spiritual bypassing? We're bypassing difficult circumstances and situations. But I think the critical difference here is that we're doing it in full awareness of what we're doing. We're aware that we're not perfect, that we're imperfect. We're aware that this is a situation that would cause in us difficult states, problematic states, that might make things more difficult for us in the future. And so we simply avoid them the way some people would avoid drugs or whatever happens to be. The critical difference between that and a state of spiritual bypassing is that if we're doing spiritual bypassing, we're really not aware of what we're doing. And it's that unawareness that's the problem. That is, we're avoiding the unpleasant mental states, the unpleasant emotions, thinking that, in fact, the numbness that results is some kind of a spiritual advance. And sometimes the emotions are so strong in us that we realize overtly, that is, we are aware cognitively, that we simply have to step back for a while and deal with something else. I talked a bit about this in my talk about the news, about dealing with the news. Sometimes we just have to shut it off. And that can be a kind of spiritual bypassing if we're doing this thinking that we're raising to a higher plane of awareness by doing that. Of course, we're not. It can be, however, a skillful example of guarding the sense doors if we are doing this in the awareness that it's a stage along a journey, and that we're doing this not because we're somehow spiritually or psychologically perfected beings, but simply we're doing this because we're imperfect, and we're trying to take a break for a moment so that we can rejoin later when we're in a better mental state. So I hope that's been a useful discussion for you about spiritual bypassing, something to keep an eye out for in yourself. I would say keep an eye out for it in others, but really what's most important here is to keep an eye out for ourselves, because that's really the only way we have direct awareness of what's going on. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm really glad to have you here. And thanks to everybody for your questions, your comments. It's been really, really great to read them all. It's been an inspiration to me to see all the interest that's out there in these kinds of topics. And so yeah, we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.